On the morning of March 15, 1945, the frozen airfield at Ramitelli, Italy, lay shrouded in a thin mist that clung to the olive-drab fuselages of 72 P-51 Mustangs like a burial shroud. First Lieutenant Marcus Jerome Washington stood beside his aircraft, number 47, watching his breath crystallize in the frigid air while mechanics from the 332nd Fighter Group performed their final pre-flight checks. The temperature hovered at -4 degrees Celsius, and Washington's fingers had already gone numb inside his leather flight gloves. In precisely 6 hours, this 23-year-old pilot from Birmingham, Alabama, a man who had been officially grounded just 11 days earlier for what his commanding officer called demonstrated intellectual deficiencies unsuitable for combat aviation, would accomplish something that no American fighter pilot had ever achieved in a single mission over European skies. The men who made that assessment believed they were protecting both the pilot and his fellow airmen. They were catastrophically wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded over the skies of Berlin that March afternoon would not only shatter every assumption about Marcus Washington's capabilities, but would fundamentally challenge the prejudices that had nearly ended his flying career before it truly began. This is the story of how one pilot's determination, combined with a desperate shortage of aircraft and an unexpected twist of fate, transformed a man dismissed as incompetent into one of the most remarkable aviators the war had ever produced, and how that transformation revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of intelligence, courage, and the systems designed to measure both. Marcus Jerome Washington was born on August 7, 1921, in the Smithfield neighborhood of Birmingham, Alabama, the third of 7 children born to Jerome and Lillian Washington. His father worked as a Pullman porter on the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, a prestigious position within the black community that provided steady income, but required Jerome to spend weeks away from home at a time. His mother took in laundry and worked as a domestic for 3 white families in the Mountain Brook area, often leaving before dawn and returning after dark. Marcus, known to his family as Little Mark, despite eventually growing to 5 feet 11 inches, developed an early fascination with anything mechanical. By age 8, he had disassembled and successfully reassembled the family's only clock, a brass anniversary model that had been his grandmother's. By 12, he was repairing radios for neighbors, earning quarters and dimes that he carefully saved in a coffee can hidden beneath his bed. The Smithfield neighborhood in those years existed as a self-contained world, bounded by the harsh realities of segregation, but sustained by institutions that nurtured excellence. Marcus attended Industrial High School, which despite its name offered a rigorous academic curriculum alongside vocational training. His mathematics teacher, a stern woman named Mrs. Constance Perkins, who had earned her degree from Fisk University, recognized something unusual in the quiet boy who sat in the 3rd row and consistently solved problems before she had finished writing them on the blackboard. She began staying after school 3 days a week to tutor him in advanced algebra and trigonometry, subjects not normally offered to students at his level. It was through Mrs. Perkins that Marcus first learned about the Civilian Pilot Training Program, a federal initiative begun in 1938 to increase the number of civilian pilots in America. The program, while officially open to all Americans, remained largely segregated in practice. However, a small number of historically black colleges had been approved as training sites, including the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Mrs. Perkins, who had never been in an airplane herself, saw in Marcus the combination of mathematical aptitude and mechanical skill that she believed flying required. She wrote to the Tuskegee Institute on his behalf, and in September of 1939, Marcus Washington enrolled as a freshman, majoring in mechanical engineering while simultaneously beginning ground school instruction for the pilot training program. The Tuskegee Institute in 1939 was a place of contradictions, founded by Booker T. Washington. In 1881, as a normal school for training black teachers, it had evolved into a comprehensive university offering degrees in agriculture, engineering, nursing, and the liberal arts. The campus covered over 5,000 acres of red Alabama clay, with stately brick buildings shaded by massive oak trees. The The students who walked its paths included the sons and daughters of doctors, lawyers and businessmen, as well as children of sharecroppers and domestic workers like Marcus. What united them was a fierce determination to excel, to prove through achievement what prejudice denied through assumption. The civilian pilot training program at Tuskegee was administered by Chief Charles Alfred Anderson, a pioneering black aviator who had taught himself to fly in 1929 and had become the first African American to earn a commercial pilot's license. Anderson, known to everyone as Chief, ran his program with military precision despite its civilian designation. Ground school met 6 days a week covering meteorology, navigation, aircraft systems, and civil air regulations. Flight instruction took place at Kennedy Field, a small grass strip located several miles from the main campus. The aircraft were Piper J-3 Cubs, fabric-covered trainers with 65 horsepower engines that cruised at 75 miles per hour. They were forgiving aircraft, perfect for beginners, but they still demanded respect. Marcus Washington took his first flight on October 14, 1939, with Chief Anderson himself at the controls. The Cub bounced down the grass runway, lifted into the air, and Marcus felt his stomach drop as the earth fell away beneath them. Anderson climbed to 3,000 feet, then handed the controls to his student. Marcus's hands trembled on the stick, but within minutes, he had the aircraft flying straight and level. Anderson noted in his logbook that evening, "Washington M shows natural coordination, unusual spatial awareness, recommend accelerated instruction." It was the highest praise the chief rarely offered. Over the following months, Marcus proved Anderson's assessment correct. He soloed after just 6 hours of dual instruction, when the average student required between 8 and 12 hours. He mastered chandelles and lazy eights, learned to land in crosswinds that made other students go around for another attempt. By May of 1940, he had earned his private pilot's license with an overall score of 97% on the written examination and a flight check that the examiner described as exceptionally precise. He was 18 years old. The war in Europe had begun in September of 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. By the spring of 1940, German forces had overrun Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. Britain stood alone against the threat, and while America remained officially neutral, it was clear to most observers that involvement was only a matter of time. The Army Air Corps began a massive expansion, establishing new training bases across the country and lowering its educational requirements for pilot candidates. Yet for black Americans who wished to serve as military aviators, the path remained blocked. The Air Corps maintained that black men lacked the intelligence, courage, and physical coordination necessary for combat flying, a position supported by studies that were later revealed to be fundamentally flawed in their methodology and conclusions. The breakthrough came through persistent pressure from civil rights organizations, black newspapers, and sympathetic politicians. In January of 1941, the War Department announced the formation of an experiment to train black pilots at Tuskegee Army Airfield, a new facility to be constructed adjacent to the Tuskegee Institute campus. The first class of aviation cadets, designated Class 42C, would begin training in July of 1941. Marcus Washington, who had just completed his sophomore year and earned his commercial pilot's license, applied immediately. His civilian pilot training program credentials and his academic record made him an obvious candidate. He was accepted into the second class, designated 42D, which would begin in September. The Tuskegee Army Airfield that Marcus Washington entered in September of 1941 was still under construction. Bulldozers carved runways from cotton fields, while workmen hammered together barracks, hangars, and classroom buildings. The cadets slept on cots in tents, while permanent quarters were completed, ate field rations, and trained in conditions that would have been considered unacceptable at any white training base. Yet they endured, driven by the knowledge that they were making history and that failure would be used to justify the prejudices that had nearly prevented the program's existence. The training program was divided into 3 phases: primary, basic, and advanced. Primary training took place in Stearman PT-17 biplanes, rugged 2-seat trainers with 220 horsepower radial engines. The aircraft had no electrical system, no starter, the propeller had to be swung by hand, and no radio. They were demanding to fly, with vicious spin characteristics that had resulted in numerous fatalities at training bases throughout the country. Cadets who survived primary moved on to basic training in Vultee BT-13 Valiants, low-wing monoplanes that introduced students to more powerful engines, retractable landing gear, and two-way radio communication. Advanced training came in North American AT-6 Texans, 600-horsepower aircraft that approximated the performance of frontline fighters. At each phase, the attrition rate was severe. Of the class that began with Marcus Washington, more than 60% would wash out before earning their wings. The reasons varied. Some cadets lacked the coordination or reaction time that flying demanded. Others struggled with the academic components of navigation and meteorology. Still others succumbed to the psychological pressure of an environment where any mistake, however small, could end a career. The instructors, a mixture of white and black pilots, were demanding but generally fair. The real obstacle was the system itself, which required black cadets to meet standards that were often higher than those applied to white students at other training bases, and which interpreted any failure as evidence that the experiment should be terminated. Marcus Washington moved through primary training without significant difficulty, soloing the steerman after just 7 hours and receiving consistently high marks from his instructors. His natural talent, honed by years of experience in the civilian pilot training program, allowed him to master each maneuver quickly. But it was during basic training that a problem emerged, one that would shadow his entire military career. The Army Air Corps administered a battery of standardized tests to all aviation cadets designed to measure intelligence, aptitude, and psychological fitness for combat. These tests had been developed in the 1920s and 30s, and while they were presented as objective measures of ability, they were in fact deeply biased toward white, middle-class test-takers from northern and Midwestern backgrounds. The questions assumed familiarity with concepts, objects, and situations that were common in white American culture, but rare in black communities, particularly in the rural South. A question might ask about the rules of polo, or the function of a particular kitchen appliance that few black families could afford, or the meaning of a slang term used primarily by white college students. The result was that black cadets consistently scored lower on these tests than their white counterparts, regardless of their actual intelligence or flying ability. Marcus Washington scored in the 31st percentile on the Army General Classification Test, a result that placed him in Category 4 out of 5 categories, the second lowest classification. His score on the Pilot Stanine Test, which purported to measure aptitude for aviation, was a 4 out of 9, considered barely acceptable for fighter training. These results were entered into his permanent record, where they would follow him throughout his service. The scores told nothing about Marcus Washington's ability to solve complex navigational problems in his head, or his photographic memory for terrain features and aircraft recognition silhouettes, or his intuitive understanding of aerodynamics that allowed him to extract maximum performance from any aircraft he flew. They measured only his familiarity with a culture that had systematically excluded him, and his experience with a testing format that had been designed without any consideration for students like him. But in the Army Air Corps of 1942, the numbers in a man's file carried more weight than the evidence of his actual performance. Marcus earned his wings on March 7, 1942, graduating third in his class of 23 cadets. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant and assigned to the 99th Pursuit Squadron, the first black flying unit in American military history. The squadron trained at Tuskegee for another year, preparing for combat deployment, while military leaders debated whether black pilots should be sent into combat at all. Finally, in April of 1943, the 99th shipped out for North Africa, where it would fly its first combat missions in support of the Allied invasion of Sicily. The squadron's commander was Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Oliver Davis, Jr., the son of the first black general in the United States Army, and himself a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. Davis was a disciplined, demanding officer who understood that his pilots would be judged not as individuals, but as representatives of their entire race. Any failure would be used to justify discrimination, while success would be attributed to luck or special treatment. He trained his men to be not just good pilots, but perfect pilots, to eliminate any excuse that might be used against them. The pressure was immense, and some men cracked under it. Marcus Washington was not one of them. The 99th's first combat came on June 9, 1943, during a patrol over the Mediterranean island of Pantelleria. Lieutenant Charles Hall scored the squadron's first victory, encountering a German Focke-Wulf 190 and achieving a decisive outcome in the encounter. Marcus Washington flew his first combat mission 2 days later, escorting bombers on a raid against targets in Sicily. He saw no enemy aircraft on that mission, or on the next 12 missions he flew. The air war in the Mediterranean was sporadic, with long periods of routine patrol punctuated by brief, intense engagements. A pilot could fly 20 missions without encountering the enemy, then face a desperate struggle for survival on the 21st. It was during this period that a controversy erupted that nearly ended the Tuskegee experiment. In September of 1943, Colonel William Maumier, commander of the 33rd Fighter Group, to which the 99th was attached, submitted a report to his superiors claiming that the black pilots had performed poorly in combat and recommending that the squadron be removed from operations and assigned to rear area duties. The report was filled with distortions and omissions. It blamed the 99th for failing to protect bombers on missions when the squadron had not even been assigned to that duty, but it was taken seriously by commanders who were already skeptical of black pilots' capabilities. Only the personal intervention of Colonel Davis, who flew to Washington to testify before the War Department's Advisory Committee on Negro Troop Policies, saved the squadron. A statistical analysis showed that the 99th's performance was comparable to that of white squadrons in the same theater, and the recommendations for disbandment were dropped. Marcus Washington knew nothing of these high-level deliberations. He knew only that he was flying combat missions, doing his job and trying to stay alive. By October of 1943, he had flown 31 missions and had not yet encountered enemy aircraft in a position that allowed engagement. He had been shot at by anti-aircraft fire numerous times, had nursed a damaged aircraft back to base on 2 occasions, and had developed the calm, methodical approach to flying that separated experienced combat pilots from novices. His flight leaders rated him as steady and reliable, a pilot who could be trusted to hold his position and follow orders. But his test scores remained in his file, a permanent asterisk on his record. The 99th moved to Italy in September of 1943, following the Allied invasion of the mainland. It was based at a succession of fields as the front moved northward, first Barcelona, then Foggia, then Madna, and finally Capodicino, near Naples. The squadron flew ground attack missions in support of the advancing armies, strafing trucks, trains, and troop concentrations. It was dangerous work. More aircraft were lost to anti-aircraft fire than to enemy fighters, but it provided little opportunity for the air-to-air combat that pilots craved. Marcus Washington flew 47 missions between September of 1943 and January of 1944 without scoring a victory. He was becoming an experienced combat pilot, but he had not yet proven himself in the ultimate test of fighter aviation. That changed in January of 1944, when the 99th was assigned to provide air cover for the Allied landings at Anzio, a daring amphibious assault designed to outflank German defensive positions south of Rome. On the morning of January 27th, Marcus was flying patrol over the beachhead when radar controllers reported a large formation of German aircraft approaching from the north. The 99th climbed to intercept, and Marcus found himself in his first major air battle. The German formation consisted of Focke-Wulf 190s, single-engine fighters that were among the best aircraft Germany produced. They were attacking in a steep dive, heading for the ships and troops on the beach below. Marcus and his wingmen turned to engage, closing rapidly on a pair of fighters that had become separated from their formation. What happened next took less than 30 seconds, but would be seared into Marcus's memory for the rest of his life. He pulled his P-40 Warhawk into a tight climbing turn, cutting inside the German leader's radius. The enemy pilot tried to reverse, but Marcus was already there, his aircraft's nose tracking the target with a smoothness that felt almost automatic. He pressed the firing button, and his .650 caliber machine guns erupted. The German aircraft began to trail smoke and descended sharply toward the sea. Marcus had scored his first victory. His wingman accounted for the second German fighter, and the rest of the enemy formation, seeing their comrade's fate, broke off the attack and fled northward. It was a small engagement by the standards of the air war, but for Marcus Washington and the 99th Pursuit Squadron, it was a validation. Over the next 2 days, the squadron would achieve multiple victories over Anzio, demonstrating once and for all that black pilots could hold their own against the best the enemy had to offer. Marcus flew 63 more missions over the following months, participating in the final push toward Rome and the invasion of southern France. He added 2 more victories to his total, becoming an ace with 5 confirmed successes. He was promoted to first lieutenant and awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions over Anzio. By any objective measure, he was one of the finest pilots in the Mediterranean theater, but his test scores remained in his file, and they would soon catch up with him. In October of 1944, the 99th Fighter Squadron was merged with 3 other squadrons, the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd, to form the 332nd Fighter Group. The group would be based at Ramitelli Airfield in Italy and would fly long-range escort missions for heavy bombers attacking targets deep inside Germany. The aircraft would be P-51 Mustangs, the finest American fighter of the war, capable of flying over 2,000 miles with external fuel tanks and matching any enemy aircraft in combat. The missions would be the most demanding and dangerous of the air war, requiring pilots to navigate across hundreds of miles of enemy territory, protect slow-moving bombers against determined fighter attacks, and fight their way home against overwhelming odds. The 332nd's new commander was Colonel Benjamin Davis, now promoted and given authority over all 4 squadrons. Davis knew that the bomber escort mission would be the ultimate test of his pilots and of the Tuskegee experiment itself. Bomber losses to enemy fighters had been staggering. On some raids, more than 20% of the aircraft failed to return, and there was intense pressure to reduce casualties. Davis established a strict policy that his pilots would stay with the bombers at all costs, never abandoning them to chase after enemy aircraft. It was a policy that would earn the 332nd the nickname Red Tails for the distinctive crimson paint on their aircraft's tail surfaces, and a reputation among bomber crews as the most reliable escorts in the theater. Marcus Washington transitioned to the P-51 Mustang in November of 1944. The aircraft was a revelation. Where the P-40 had been heavy and sluggish, the Mustang was light and responsive. Where the P-40 had struggled above 20,000 feet, the Mustang was comfortable at 30,000 and could reach 38,000 in a pinch. The engine was a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin, one of the finest power plants of the war, producing over 1,500 horsepower and giving the aircraft a top speed of 440 miles per hour. Marcus fell in love with the Mustang the first time he flew it and spent every available hour learning its capabilities. His first escort mission came on November 16, 1944, when the 332nd accompanied B-17 Flying Fortresses on a raid against an oil refinery near Vienna. The flight was uneventful. No enemy fighters appeared, but Marcus experienced the peculiar exhaustion of a long-range mission for the first time. 6 hours in the cockpit, much of it above 25,000 feet on supplemental oxygen, left him drained in ways that shorter missions never had. He understood now why bomber escort was considered the most demanding assignment in fighter aviation. Over the following months, Marcus flew 41 escort missions into Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. He participated in attacks on Berlin, Munich, and the industrial Ruhr Valley. He saw bombers go down in flames, watched parachutes blossom against the sky, and engaged enemy fighters on 8 separate occasions, achieving 2 more victories to bring his total to 7. He was now one of the leading aces of the 332nd, respected by his peers and trusted by his superiors. But in March of 1945, his test scores finally caught up with him. The precipitating incident occurred on March 4, 1945, during a mission briefing for an escort to Berlin. The briefing officer, a white major from 15th Air Force Headquarters, was explaining the route when he noticed that Marcus was not taking notes. He stopped his presentation and demanded to know why Lieutenant Washington was not writing down the information. Marcus replied that he did not need to. He had already memorized the route, the checkpoints, the emergency airfields, and the radio frequencies. The major, clearly irritated, tested him on several details. Marcus answered every question correctly without hesitation. After the briefing, the major pulled Colonel Davis aside and expressed concern about Lieutenant Washington. He had reviewed Washington's personnel file and noted the low test scores. In his opinion, a pilot with such limited intellectual capacity should not be flying long-range missions into Germany, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. He recommended that Washington be grounded, pending a review of his qualifications. Colonel Davis faced a difficult decision. He knew that Marcus Washington was one of his best pilots, that test scores meant little compared to actual combat performance, and that the major's concerns were rooted in prejudice rather than evidence. But he also knew that defying a headquarters staff officer could bring unwanted scrutiny to the entire group, at a time when its survival remained precarious. The Tuskegee experiment had enemies in high places, men who were looking for any excuse to disband it and reassign the pilots to non-flying duties. Davis needed to pick his battles carefully. He compromised. He grounded Marcus Washington from combat operations, but did not initiate separation proceedings. Instead, he assigned Marcus to the operations section, where he would help plan missions and track aircraft. It was a desk job, humiliating for a combat pilot, but it kept Marcus in the unit and preserved the possibility of returning to flying status. Davis also quietly requested that a psychologist be sent to evaluate Washington and provide an objective assessment of his capabilities. Until that evaluation was completed, Marcus would not fly. The grounding hit Marcus harder than any anti-aircraft shell he had ever faced. He had spent 4 years proving himself, overcoming every obstacle, and achieving success by any measure that mattered. And now, because of numbers on a test he had taken as a 20-year-old cadet, numbers that measured nothing about his actual abilities, he was being told that he was too stupid to do the job he had been doing successfully for 2 years. The injustice of it burned in him like a fire that could not be extinguished. The psychologist arrived on March 10th, a Captain Robert Chen, who had trained at Columbia University and had spent 2 years evaluating pilots in the European theater. Chen was a careful, methodical man who distrusted standardized tests and preferred to assess individuals through observation and conversation. He spent 2 days with Marcus Washington, administering a battery of assessments that were different from the standard Army tests, more culturally neutral, more focused on specific cognitive abilities rather than general knowledge. He also observed Marcus in the operations room, noting how he processed information, solved problems, and interacted with complex tactical situations. Chen's evaluation would not be completed until March 18th, 1 week away. In the meantime, Marcus Washington sat at a desk in the operations room, watching his friends fly missions into Germany without him. He plotted their routes, tracked their fuel consumption, recorded their victories and losses. He was there on March 11th when Lieutenant Robert Williams was reported missing over Austria, and on March 13th when Captain Charles Thomas's aircraft was so badly damaged by enemy fire that he had to bail out over Yugoslavia. He tracked every mission with meticulous care, channeling his frustration into the work, but inside he was dying by inches. On March 14th, the situation changed dramatically. The 332nd received orders for a maximum effort mission to Berlin on March 15th. Every available aircraft and pilot would be required. The 15th Air Force was sending over 1,000 bombers against the German capital, and fighter losses were expected to be severe. Colonel Davis reviewed his pilot roster and found himself 4 short. 3 pilots were in the hospital with various ailments, and one, Marcus Washington, was grounded. Davis called Marcus into his office that evening. The colonel's face was tired, lined with the strain of 20 months of combat command. He told Marcus about the mission, about the pilot shortage, about the difficult decision he faced. He could not order Marcus to fly, the grounding was still in effect, but he was asking. The group needed him. Marcus did not hesitate. He would fly. The mission briefing was at 0400 hours on March 15th. The pilots gathered in the briefing room, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, as the intelligence officer unveiled the target map. Berlin. The collective groan that went up was part ritual, part genuine apprehension. Berlin was the most heavily defended city in Europe, protected by over 1,000 anti-aircraft guns and multiple fighter wings. Every mission to Berlin was a gauntlet. The route would take them north across the Adriatic, then northwest across Yugoslavia and Austria, then north into Germany. The escort would pick up the bombers over southern Germany and accompany them to the target and back. Total flight time would be approximately 7 hours. External fuel tanks would extend their range, but there was no margin for error. Any pilot who lost his external tanks early or who used too much fuel in combat would not make it home. Marcus listened to the briefing with complete attention, memorizing the route, the checkpoints, the emergency procedures. He noted the expected enemy strength. Intelligence believed that the German Air Force would mount a maximum effort to defend the capital, possibly including some of the new jet aircraft that had been appearing over Germany since the summer. The Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was 50 miles per hour faster than the Mustang and carried 430mm cannons that could destroy a bomber with a single burst. The jets were not numerous. German factories were being hammered day and night, and fuel was desperately short. But they were fearsome when they appeared. The pilots walked to their aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath steaming in the cold air. Marcus found his Mustang, number 47, already being prepared by his crew chief, Staff Sergeant William Monroe. Monroe was a 28-year-old from Chicago who had been maintaining aircraft for 3 years and who knew number 47 better than Marcus did. He had already completed the pre-flight inspection, but Marcus walked around the aircraft anyway, checking the control surfaces, the tires, the engine cowling. Everything was in order. He climbed into the cockpit, settled into the seat, and began his startup checklist. The Merlin engine caught on the first try, coughing blue smoke, and then settling into a smooth idle. Marcus checked his instruments, his radios, his oxygen system. Everything was functioning. He looked down the flight line and saw other Mustangs starting up, their propellers spinning into silver discs. At 0530, the first aircraft began to taxi, and Marcus fell into his place in the line. The takeoff was routine, the formation assembly accomplished without incident. By 0600, 70 Mustangs of the 332nd Fighter Group were heading north in 4 squadron formations, climbing toward their cruising altitude of 28,000 feet. Marcus was flying number 3 position in the second flight of the 99th Squadron, with Captain Thomas Patterson leading. Patterson was a veteran with 9 victories, a steady hand who kept his flight together and did not take unnecessary risks. Marcus trusted him completely. The flight across the Adriatic was peaceful, almost beautiful. The sun rose behind them, painting the scattered clouds pink and gold. To the west, the mountains of the Italian peninsula were visible, still capped with snow. It was hard to believe, at moments like this, that they were flying toward death and destruction, but the reality came back soon enough as they crossed into enemy territory, and the first anti-aircraft bursts appeared ahead of them, black puffs marking the air with malevolent precision. The formation altered course slightly, avoiding the heaviest concentrations of anti-aircraft fire. They were over Yugoslavia now, a mountainous land that Marcus had come to know well from previous missions. Down there, partisans were fighting the occupiers, living in caves and forests, striking from ambush and then disappearing. It was a different kind of war than the one Marcus fought, but it was the same enemy. Over Austria, they rendezvoused with the bomber stream. The sight never failed to awe Marcus, no matter how many times he saw it. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators stretched across the sky, their contrails forming a white highway in the blue. Each bomber carried 10 men and up to 8,000 pounds of bombs. The concentration of courage and firepower was almost beyond comprehension, and they were so vulnerable, these slow-moving giants, unable to evade or outrun the fighters that would soon be coming for them. The escort positioned itself around the bombers, the Mustangs weaving back and forth to match the slower aircraft's speed. Marcus scanned the sky constantly, looking for the specks that would become enemy fighters. The controller was reporting activity to the north, bandits climbing from airfields around Berlin, but nothing was visible yet. The tension in the cockpit was palpable, a tightness in the chest, a heightened awareness of every sensation. This was the waiting, the part Marcus hated most, knowing that combat was coming, but not knowing when or where. The enemy appeared at 11:37 hours, just as the bomber stream was approaching the initial point for the bomb run. Marcus saw them first, a swarm of dots emerging from a cloud bank to the northeast. He keyed his radio and called out the contact. "Bandits, 2 o'clock high, 50 plus. The formation tightened, the pilots craning their necks to locate the threat. And then Marcus saw something that made his blood run cold. Among the conventional fighters, he could make out Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s. There were shapes that were different, sleeker, without propellers. Jets. At least 6 of them, possibly more. The Me-262 had come to defend Berlin. Colonel Davis's voice came over the radio, calm and controlled. "Red Flight, take the jets. Everyone else, protect the bombers." Marcus was in red flight. He pushed his throttle forward, feeling the Mustang surge ahead as the engine climbed toward maximum power. The jets were diving now, heading for the bombers with terrifying speed. They would be in firing range in less than a minute. What happened over the next 23 minutes would become one of the most studied aerial engagements of the war. It would be analyzed in intelligence reports, examined in tactical studies, and recounted in books written decades later. But for Marcus Washington, it was not a historical event. It was survival, pure and simple, a desperate fight against enemies that were faster, better armed, and seemingly impossible to catch. The first jet he encountered came from above and behind, diving through the formation at over 500 miles per hour. Marcus saw it flash past, its cannons blazing, and watched in horror as a B-17 took hits along its fuselage and began to fall away, smoke pouring from its No. 3 engine. There was no way to catch a jet in a dive. The Mustang simply did not have the speed. But Marcus had been thinking about this problem for months, reading everything he could find about jet tactics, and he believed there was a way. The jets were fast, but they were not maneuverable. Their high speed meant wide turning radii, and their engines took a long time to spool up from idle to full power. The key was to anticipate where the jet would be, not to chase where it had been, and the jets had to slow down to aim their cannons accurately. That was the moment of vulnerability. Marcus watched as the jet that had hit the bomber pulled up from its dive, trading speed for altitude. He did not chase it. Instead, he kept his eye on another jet that was positioning for an attack run on a different group of bombers. This one was coming from the side, flying relatively level, lining up for a deflection shot. Marcus turned toward it, not directly at the jet, but at a point in space where he calculated the jet would be in 15 seconds if it continued its present course. The geometry worked. As the jet pilot focused on his bombing targets, Marcus closed the distance from the side, unnoticed. At 400 yards, he opened fire. The .50 caliber rounds reached out, a stream of tracers showing their path, and Marcus saw impacts on the jet's wing and fuselage. The aircraft shuddered, yawed sharply, and then began a slow roll to the left. Marcus fired again, and this time he saw pieces flying off. The jet went into a steep dive, trailing smoke, and Marcus watched it go, unwilling to follow and lose his altitude advantage. He did not see it impact. There was no time, but he knew it was out of the fight. One down. But there were more, many more, and they were everywhere. The next engagement came less than a minute later. A jet was climbing back up after a firing pass, slow and vulnerable, and Marcus dove on it from above. This time the enemy pilot saw him coming and tried to evade, but the jet's poor maneuverability at low speed worked against him. Marcus cut inside his turn, close to 200 yards, and fired a long burst into the cockpit area. The jet nosed over and went straight down. 2. Marcus climbed back to altitude, breathing hard, his oxygen mask damp with sweat. He checked his fuel, still okay, and his ammunition getting low. Around him the air battle raged. He saw a Mustang take hits and spiral away, the pilot bailing out. He saw a bomber explode, a direct hit from a jet's cannons, the debris falling in a long trail. He saw another jet go down, claimed by one of his squadron mates. The radio was a chaos of calls, warnings, and cries. A jet came at him head-on, the most dangerous attack angle because closure speed was highest and reaction time shortest. Marcus pushed over into a dive, passing beneath the jet's line of fire, feeling his aircraft buffet as the cannon rounds passed close overhead. He pulled up hard, grunting against the G-forces, and reversed his turn. The jet was trying to extend away, but Marcus had anticipated its move and was already cutting it off. He fired at maximum range 500 yards and saw hits on the tail. The jet began to smoke, slowed, and then Marcus was on it, closing to 100 yards, firing until his guns fell silent. The jet went down in flames. 3. His ammunition was gone. He had fired over 1,800 rounds in less than 10 minutes, and his 6 guns were empty. Standard procedure was to withdraw, to return to base and rearm. But Marcus could see that the bomber formation was still under attack, that jets were still making firing passes, that the escorts were spread too thin. If he left, more bombers would die. He made a decision that violated every tactical principle he had been taught. He attacked the jets without ammunition, diving on them, forcing them to evade, breaking up their attack runs. The jet pilots did not know his guns were empty. They only saw a Mustang coming at them with aggressive intent. They broke off their attacks, went evasive, wasted time and fuel avoiding an enemy who could not hurt them. Marcus was a decoy now, a target, and he knew that sooner or later one of the jets would get behind him and realize the truth. It almost happened over the outskirts of Berlin. A jet that Marcus had just forced off a bomber reversed its turn and came back at him, closing fast. Marcus broke hard left, pulling maximum G, trying to keep his tail away from the enemy's guns. The jet followed, matching his turn, closing to 300 yards. Marcus could see the muzzle flashes as the pilot opened fire, could hear the thumps as 30mm rounds struck his aircraft. Red warning lights lit up on his instrument panel. He had taken hits, though he did not yet know how bad. He was out of options. The jet was faster, had longer range weapons, and was now sitting behind him in perfect firing position. In another 2 seconds, the enemy pilot would adjust his aim and tear the Mustang apart. Marcus did the only thing he could think of. He chopped his throttle and threw out his dive brakes, decelerating as violently as possible. The jet pilot, fixated on his target, did not react in time. He overshot, passing so close that Marcus could see the black crosses on his fuselage, could see the pilot's helmeted head, turning to look at the Mustang he had just passed. And then Marcus did something that even he would later struggle to explain. He did not evade or run. He pushed his throttle back to full power and went after the jet. The enemy pilot, having overshot, was now trying to accelerate away and reposition for another attack. But jet engines needed time to build thrust, and for a few precious seconds, the Me-262 was actually slower than the pursuing Mustang. Marcus closed the distance, driven by an instinct he did not fully understand. And then he realized that his guns were still empty, that he could not shoot even if he got into position. But the jet pilot did not know that. He saw a Mustang on his tail, closing rapidly, and he panicked. He broke hard, losing speed, trying to shake the pursuer. Marcus followed, matching every move, forcing the jet lower and lower. They were below 1,000 feet now, screaming across the Berlin suburbs, the Mustang's propeller clawing for purchase in the thin, cold air. The jet pilot, desperate, pulled up sharply, trying to use his superior climb rate to escape. But he was too low, too slow. The jet stalled, nosed over, and went into the ground. Marcus saw the fireball, felt the concussion and pulled up to avoid the debris. 4 jets. He had now achieved results against 4 enemy jet aircraft, the last one without firing a shot. But the battle was not over. As Marcus climbed back toward the bomber stream, he saw another jet positioning for an attack run. His guns were empty, his aircraft was damaged, and he was running low on fuel. Every rational calculation said he should withdraw, but there were still bombers to protect, still men who would die if he left. He attacked again, diving on the jet, forcing it to evade. This time, the enemy pilot was warier. He did not engage, did not try to turn with the Mustang, just accelerated away and repositioned. Marcus followed as long as he could, but his damaged aircraft was losing power. One of the 30mm hits must have nicked an engine component, and he could not keep up. The jet pulled away, circled around, and came back for another pass at the bombers. Marcus positioned himself in front of the jet, directly in its line of fire. He was daring the pilot to shoot him instead of the bombers, offering himself as a target. It was a suicide move, a gesture of pure sacrifice. The jet pilot could easily have killed him and then attacked the bombers anyway. But he did not. Perhaps he respected the courage of the lone Mustang. Perhaps he was simply running low on ammunition or fuel. Whatever the reason, he broke off his attack and dove away toward the east. The bombers he had been targeting completed their bomb run and turned for home. Marcus followed the bomber stream south, nursing his damaged aircraft. He had lost his external fuel tanks during the fight. He had no memory of jettisoning them, but they were gone. And his internal fuel was alarmingly low. He leaned his mixture until the engine ran rough, reducing fuel consumption, but also reducing power. He descended to a lower altitude where the air was denser and the engine could breathe easier. He did the calculations in his head, over and over: distance to Ramitelli, fuel remaining, rate of consumption. The numbers did not look good. He crossed the Austrian border with 40 gallons of fuel remaining. Ramitelli was still 250 miles away. At his current consumption rate, he would run dry somewhere over the Adriatic. He considered landing at an emergency field in Yugoslavia, but most were controlled by partisans with uncertain loyalties, and the terrain around them was dangerous. He decided to press on, to try to make Ramitelli, to trust in the calculations he had done so many times before. The engine quit 20 miles from the coast, sputtering, coughing, and then falling silent. Marcus had been expecting it, had already trimmed the aircraft for best glide speed, but the sudden quiet was still shocking. The Mustang became a glider, sinking toward the grey waters of the Adriatic at approximately 1,000 feet per minute. He had maybe 15 minutes before he hit the water. He called out his position on the radio, declared his emergency, and started preparing for a water landing. He tightened his harness, unlocked his canopy, and reviewed the ditching procedure in his mind. The Mustang was not designed for water landings. The air scoop under the fuselage would catch and flip the aircraft. But if he could keep the wings level and touch down at minimum speed, he might survive the impact. The coastline appeared ahead, a thin line of green and tan separating the blue of the sea from the blue of the sky. Marcus did not think he could reach it. He was too low, sinking too fast. But then he saw the runway, Ramitelli, its concrete strip shimmering in the afternoon sun. It was closer than he had realized, just barely within reach. He adjusted his glide path, trading altitude for distance, stretching every foot he could from his dead aircraft. He crossed the threshold at 50 feet, barely flying, the Mustang mushing toward a stall. He had no engine, no ability to go around, no second chance. He held the aircraft off as long as he could, feeling for the ground, and then the wheels touched. The Mustang rolled out, slowing, and stopped on the runway with its tail wheel resting on the last concrete panel. He had made it by a matter of yards. Marcus sat in the cockpit for a long moment, unable to move. His hands were shaking. His legs were weak, and his mind was struggling to process what had just happened. Then the ground crew was there, Staff Sergeant Monroe climbing up on the wing, shouting, asking if he was okay. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. He had never been so tired in his life. The debriefing lasted 3 hours. Intelligence officers questioned Marcus in detail about every aspect of his engagement with the jets, recording his responses and comparing them with reports from other pilots. Gun camera film, Marcus's camera had recorded the first 3 victories before running out of film, was developed and analyzed. Claims were verified compared with ground reports and radar tracks. When it was over, Marcus Washington was credited with 4 confirmed victories and 3 probables in a single mission, all against jet aircraft. It was an unprecedented achievement. Colonel Davis came to see Marcus in his quarters that evening. The colonel looked even more tired than Marcus felt. Worn down by the strain of command and the losses of the day, the 332nd had lost 4 pilots over Berlin, good men who would never come home. But there was something else in Davis's expression, something that Marcus had rarely seen: joy. "Washington," Davis said, "I owe you an apology." Marcus started to protest, but Davis held up his hand. "I know why you were grounded. I know what they said about you. And I knew it was wrong. I've known it from the day you joined this unit. But I let them do it anyway, Because I was trying to protect the group, trying to avoid a fight that I didn't think we could win. That was my mistake." Marcus did not know what to say. He had never heard Colonel Davis admit to a mistake before. "You did something today that nobody thought was possible," Davis continued. "Not just the victories, though those were incredible, but the way you stayed in the fight when you had no ammunition, the way you protected those bombers with nothing but your aircraft and your courage. You showed what a pilot can do when he's given the chance. You showed what we can all do." Davis reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "The 15th Air Force commander called me an hour ago. He's recommending you for the Distinguished Service Cross. I'm recommending you for something else." He handed Marcus the box. Inside was a pair of captain's bars. "Congratulations, Captain Washington. You've earned this, and a lot more besides." Marcus took the bars, feeling their weight in his palm. They were just bits of metal, symbols, but they represented something he had been fighting for his entire career. Recognition, based on performance, not prejudice. He had finally received it. The psychologist's evaluation arrived 3 days later. Captain Chen had concluded that Marcus Washington possessed exceptional spatial reasoning ability, superior reaction time, and an intuitive understanding of three-dimensional tactical situations that far exceeds the norm for combat pilots. He also noted that Marcus's performance on standard Army tests reflected cultural and educational biases in the testing instruments rather than actual cognitive limitations. His recommendation was that Marcus be returned to full flight status immediately and that his test scores be annotated to reflect their invalidity. The evaluation was forwarded to 15th Air Force Headquarters, where it caused considerable embarrassment. The same major who had recommended Marcus's grounding was now faced with evidence that his judgment had been catastrophically wrong. Rather than admit error, the major tried to bury the evaluation, to keep it from the files where it might raise uncomfortable questions. But Colonel Davis had anticipated this move. He had already sent copies to the War Department, to the NAACP, and to several black newspapers. The story of the pilot who had been grounded for being too dumb and had then achieved an unprecedented victory against jets was too good to suppress. Marcus flew 12 more missions before the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. He added one more conventional victory to his total, bringing his final score to 8 confirmed, making him one of the highest-scoring pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross with clusters, and the Air Medal with clusters. He was offered a regular commission in the peacetime Army Air Forces and accepted, determined to continue flying and to help break down the barriers that had nearly ended his career. But the significance of March 15, 1945, went beyond individual achievement. The mission demonstrated conclusively that black pilots could perform at the highest levels of air combat against the most advanced aircraft the enemy possessed. It provided evidence that standardized tests were poor predictors of actual performance, that prejudice masquerading as science could lead to catastrophic errors of judgment, and it showed that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle, even the seemingly insuperable obstacle of institutionalized racism. The story spread through the black community and beyond. Newspapers covered it, magazines featured it, and Marcus Washington became a symbol of excellence triumphing over bigotry. He received hundreds of letters from young black men and women who had been told they were not smart enough, not capable enough, not worthy enough, and who took hope from his example. He answered every letter encouraging the writers to pursue their dreams, to never let others' prejudice define their limits. The integration of the United States military, which would come in 1948 with President Truman's Executive Order 9981, was built in part on the foundation that the Tuskegee Airmen had laid. The performance of the 332nd Fighter Group, over 150 victories, more than 900 successful bomber escort missions, a reputation for reliability that was second to none, made it impossible to maintain the fiction that black service members could not perform as well as whites. Marcus Washington's achievement over Berlin was one brick in that foundation, but it was a brick that mattered. After the war, Marcus remained in the newly independent United States Air Force, flying jet fighters in the years that followed. He commanded a squadron during the Korean conflict and earned additional decorations for his service there. He rose to the rank of colonel, breaking barrier after barrier, and retired in 1968 after 26 years of service. He then earned a master's degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Southern California and worked for a major aircraft manufacturer until his final retirement in 1983. But he never forgot March 15, 1945. He never forgot what it felt like to be told he was too stupid to fly, and then to prove in the most dramatic way imaginable that the people who said it were wrong. He told the story to his children and grandchildren, not to boast but to teach. The lesson was always the same. Never let anyone else define your capabilities. Never accept limits that others try to place on you. Trust in yourself, work harder than anyone thinks possible, and show them what you can do. The standardized tests that had nearly ended Marcus Washington's career continued to be used by the military for decades afterward, though they were gradually revised to reduce cultural bias. The Army General Classification Test was retired in 1954 and replaced with the Armed Forces Qualification Test, which underwent its own revisions over the years. Today, the military uses the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, which has been repeatedly validated for fairness across demographic groups. The journey from biased tests to fair ones took generations, and it was driven in part by cases like Marcus's, cases where tests that were supposed to measure ability instead measured only familiarity with a particular culture's norms. Captain Robert Chen, the psychologist who evaluated Marcus Washington, went on to become one of the leading critics of standardized testing in the military. He published numerous papers showing how cultural bias in tests led to misclassification of capable individuals and to the waste of human potential. His work influenced generations of test designers and contributed to the improvements that eventually came. He remained in touch with Marcus for many years, and when he retired, Marcus wrote him a letter of thanks. "You saw what the tests couldn't see," Marcus wrote. "You saw me." The jets that Marcus Washington engaged over Berlin were part of the last desperate defense of the German capital. By March of 1945, the war was clearly lost, but the German leadership refused to surrender, and thousands more would die in the final 2 months of fighting. The jet program, which had shown such promise, never achieved its potential because of fuel shortages, production problems, and the destruction of the factories that built the aircraft. Of the approximately 1,400 Me-262s produced, only about 200 ever saw combat, and most of those were lost to accidents, fuel exhaustion, or attacks while landing or taking off. Marcus Washington's 4 victories were a significant fraction of the total jets lost to American fighters during the war. Staff Sergeant William Monroe, who had maintained Marcus's aircraft so expertly, also remained in the Air Force and rose to the rank of Chief Master Sergeant. He served until 1966 and then worked as a civilian aircraft mechanic until retirement. He and Marcus stayed friends for life, bound by the experience of that March morning when they had prepared number 47 for its last combat mission. Monroe always claimed that he knew something special would happen that day. "Captain Washington had a look in his eye," he said. He wasn't going to let them keep him down. The men who were lost on March 15, 1945, Lieutenants Jackson, Morris, Carter, and Williams, were buried in the American military cemetery at Nettuno, Italy, near the Anzio beachhead, where the 332nd had first proven itself in combat. Their graves are marked with white crosses standing in perfect rows, identical to all the others, giving no hint of the special significance of their sacrifice. They were Tuskegee Airmen, pioneers, men who flew and fought for a country that did not fully accept them, and they gave their lives in the hope that their service would make things better for those who came after. Their hope was not misplaced. Colonel Benjamin Oliver Davis, Jr., retired from the Air Force in 1970 as a lieutenant general, the first black American to reach that rank. He had commanded the 13th Air Force, served as Deputy Commander of United States Strike Command, and earned virtually every decoration for valor and service that the nation could bestow. When he died in 2002, he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, and his funeral was attended by dignitaries from across the country. But the men who knew him best remembered him not for his rank or his decorations, but for his leadership at Ramitelli, for the way he fought for his pilots and demanded excellence while protecting them from a system that wanted them to fail. Marcus Washington spoke at the funeral, his voice still strong at 80 years old. "Colonel Davis believed in us when nobody else did," he said. "He made us believe in ourselves. That was his greatest achievement." The Tuskegee Airmen were collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in 2007, recognizing their service and sacrifice. President George W. Bush presented the medal in a ceremony at the United States Capitol, attended by more than 300 of the surviving airmen. Marcus Washington was there, 96 years old and still sharp, still able to recount every detail of March 15, 1945. He received a standing ovation when he was introduced, and he waved to the crowd with the same hand that had once gripped the control stick of a P-51 Mustang over Berlin. The lessons of Marcus Washington's story extend far beyond military history or racial justice, though those elements are central. His story is about the human capacity for excellence when given the opportunity, about the danger of judging people by metrics that do not measure what matters, and about the power of determination to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. It is a story that resonates because it touches something universal, the desire to be seen for who we really are, not for who others assume us to be. The test scores that nearly ended Marcus Washington's career were not wrong because they were poorly designed, though they were. They were wrong because they claimed to measure something they could not measure, the full range of human capability. They reduced a complex individual to a single number and used that number to make decisions that affected his life and career. That is a danger that exists in any system that relies on standardized metrics, and it is a danger that we must always guard against. Marcus Washington died on January 4, 2014, at the age of 92. His obituary appeared in newspapers across the country, and the stories all highlighted his achievement over Berlin, his role in breaking barriers, his long and distinguished career. But the people who knew him remembered other things: his kindness, his willingness to help young people, his insistence that anyone could achieve great things if they worked hard and refused to give up. He was a man who had been tested in every sense of the word, and he had passed every test that mattered. In his study at his home in Los Angeles, Marcus kept a framed copy of the evaluation that Captain Chen had written in March of 1945. He kept it not as a trophy, but as a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything, and of the importance of people who are willing to look beyond the numbers and see the human being. Beside it was a photograph of his aircraft, number 47, taken at Ramitelli on March 14, 1945, the day before his great mission. The Mustang gleams in the Italian sun, its red tail distinctive even in black and white. On the fuselage, below the cockpit rail, is the name that Marcus had chosen for his aircraft. He called it Determination. The Berlin mission of March 15, 1945, was not the most important air battle of the war, nor were Marcus Washington's victories the most significant of the conflict. There were larger battles, more victories, greater strategic consequences. But there was something about one pilot in one damaged aircraft, with no ammunition and barely enough fuel, fighting against jets that were supposedly unbeatable. That captured a truth about what human beings are capable of when they refuse to accept the limits that others place on them. That truth is the real legacy of Marcus Washington's flight, and it is a legacy that belongs to everyone who has ever been told they cannot do something and done it anyway. The aircraft that Marcus flew on March 15, 1945, was too badly damaged to repair economically and was written off after his return. The airframe was scrapped, the engine was sent back for rebuild, and the useful components were salvaged for other aircraft. Nothing physical remains of number 47 except photographs and memories. But the aircraft story lives on, told and retold, inspiring new generations of pilots and dreamers. When young people today stand in front of the displays at the National Air and Space Museum's Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, looking at the preserved P-51 Mustang painted in the red-tailed livery of the 332nd Fighter Group, many of them are thinking about Marcus Washington and what he did over Berlin. They are thinking about what they might do if they are given the chance. The greatest victories are not always the ones that appear in official records. The greatest victories are sometimes the ones that take place inside a person when they overcome doubt and fear and prejudice to discover what they are truly capable of. Marcus Washington achieved that kind of victory on March 15, 1945, and he spent the rest of his life helping others achieve it too. He never stopped believing that anyone could do great things, regardless of what others thought of them. He never stopped fighting for that belief, and he never stopped flying in his heart, even after his body could no longer take him into the sky. The sky over Berlin in March of 1945 was contested ground, a place where the old world of propellers and pistons met the new world of jets and rocket engines. Marcus Washington flew into that sky as a man who had been judged and found wanting, a man whose career was supposed to be over. He flew out as something else entirely, a symbol, a legend, a proof of concept for human potential. The numbers in his file never changed, but the numbers stopped mattering after that day. The only numbers that mattered were the ones on his wings and on his scoreboard. 4 confirmed, 3 probable, 7 jets engaged, every bomber protected. Those were the numbers that defined Marcus Washington, and those were the numbers that he left as his legacy. The morning mist that had clung to the airfield at Ramitelli on March 15, 1945, had burned off by the time Marcus Washington made his dead-stick landing that afternoon. The sun was shining, the air was clear, and the 70-year-old conflict was rushing toward its conclusion. In 7 weeks, Germany would surrender unconditionally, and the war in Europe would be over. The world would begin the long process of rebuilding, of coming to terms with what had happened, and of trying to ensure that it would never happen again. That process is still ongoing, still incomplete, still requiring the courage and determination that Marcus Washington displayed over Berlin. We tell these stories not just to remember but to learn. We learn that prejudice is not wisdom, that assumptions are not facts, and that the measure of a person cannot be captured in any test. We learn that courage comes in many forms, some loud and some quiet, and that the greatest courage is sometimes simply the refusal to give up when everyone says you should. We learn that history is not just the story of nations and armies, but also the story of individuals who make choices that shape the world. Marcus Jerome Washington made his choice on March 15, 1945. He chose to fly when he could have stayed safely on the ground. He chose to fight when he had nothing to fight with. He chose to protect when his own survival was in doubt. And in making those choices, he proved not just what he was capable of, but what we are all capable of, when we refuse to accept the limits that others try to place on us. That is the legacy of the pilot who was grounded for being too dumb and then achieved something that no one had done before. That is the lesson of that cold March morning, that terrible and magnificent day over Berlin. And that is the story that we tell again and again so that we might learn it and live it and pass it on. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World Conflict, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.